Hello and welcome everyone. I am here at ESIF office talking to Frank Lavin. Frank is not just a dear friend of us here at ESIF, he's also had a long career in US politics, starting out working as a political director in the Reagan White House in the 1980s. And his last position was that he was working under George W. Bush as the Undersecretary for International Trade. We're going to talk about United States and China, what's going on there. So, Frank, the biggest news story in global trade over the past couple of years has been the relation between United States and China. I thought, at least for a while this spring, that they were actually edging closer towards a deal. But what we've seen lately is that both sides are now ramping up tariffs, and you see a greater sort of hostility in the overall rhetoric coming out. So, how do you explain the situation that we're in right now?
I think that's a fair summary to where we are now. It's probably the most troubled trade relationship the United States has. Therefore, you would think would be the greatest focus of its efforts. In fact, the interesting element is that the Trump administration spent so much time with NAFTA renegotiations or Korea renegotiations when most people thought the system was working pretty well, and they were very, very different from China. But for the last year or so, it's been a heavy China focus. And I think you're right, there were indications of considerable progress being made and expectations of some kind of signing ceremony, and then it fell apart. And once things fall apart, there tend to be public recriminations and accusations and so forth, and new tariffs. So it's not just fallen apart, but there's been an element of acrimony added to this as well. By the way, some of this is consistent with historical patterns, meaning some part of trade negotiation with China is a pricing mechanism where you're just trying to establish the other party's price. And you can only establish this through testing the market. And so part of backing away from a deal is to say, did I not offer enough? So this is a reasonably common practice from China's perspective, is to say, let's come in a little bit low and think if you're willing to settle, you're willing to settle. And whether they miscalculated or signals weren't set the right way, I can't speak to specifics, but clearly there was a gap, a mismatch. And Trump negotiates in public. I mean, this is his personality, and he's particularly unhappy with this, and Bob Lighthizer was unhappy as well. So it went public. That's tactically, questionable move, but that's where it ended up. China reacted, I think, in quite a predictable fashion, which is to say, different countries can always disagree as to what should happen in trade, but don't impugn China in a public fashion and stigmatize them for being at fault. Although that might very well be a valid point, but it doesn't advance you toward your goals, so you might be better off just not saying it. So China spent several weeks responding vigorously to this sort of allegation and that it's at fault or it changed its positions. And as a result, things are at a standstill. Now, there was hope that at the G20 meeting in Japan that the two parties will get together. And again, Xi and Trump have always had, I think, a reasonably professional relationship, and both leaders have made it a point not to personally criticize the other. So there's reasonable hope that they get together in Japan and maybe get it back on track. And what happened just in the last few days is President Trump said words to the effect that if Xi isn't interested in the meeting or doesn't take a meeting, that he'll add on yet additional tariffs. Now, if that's actually what he said, I think it makes it very difficult for the Chinese leader to respond. If it's a mischaracterization, if it's a party misreporting what was said, then there's still possibility of a meeting. So this whole problem might drag out for several more months till they can even get back into a conversation again.
But do you think that the Trump administration, that they want to resolve this with a deal, or do they see that there is a benefit of sort of having a trade war with the United States going on when the election season starts, right, and you can sort of he can continue to beat that sort of anti-trade drum that he successfully used?
Well, there are a few things going on here. There are a few things going on here. I don't think it's necessarily quite as you just the opposite you gave, but I think there's elements of that. One element is I don't think at the beginning of the China trade talks there was the normal consensus from the U.S. side as to what would constitute success. because Trump comes into office with this sort of vague view that China is being unfair or China's not doing the right thing. So, but there are people who are hard on trade, but I would think fundamentally rationalists like Bob Lighthizer, and there are also people like Peter Navarro who are China hawks. So there's a range of opinions within the administration. So I think that took a while to work out what is a good deal, what can we accept, what is China willing to do. And as one example, initially in the negotiations, the U.S. was making demands for China to change its industrial policy. Well, it's one thing to move away from China 2025 to say that China should not exclusively grant Chinese companies privileges that it's not granting for. That's a reasonable request. It's another step altogether to say it must change its entire industrial policy. That's just a much more complicated set of activities. But so the United States, I think, backed off largely off of that and just looking for fair treatment with compulsory licensing, intellectual property, market access, what we would say conventional trade goals. But that took, I think, a year to work through that process. And you made another interesting point too. I don't think Trump does want permanent friction. I think he does want to have some resolution that he can point to, and he's proud of what he believes he's accomplished with the renegotiations of NAFTA. He repeatedly invokes that. I think regardless of what comes out of China, he will celebrate this and find a way to say it was a success. It might be a success of sorts. But to your point, I think it is fair to say Trump has more of an appetite for friction than most U.S. presidents, and he's more likely to see friction or turmoil as a useful step, as a useful tactic. So I think typically U.S. president or U.S. government leadership would say we don't really seek this. I think it's predictable to say he does sometimes sort of seek it. And to my mind, that makes some of China's moves over the last 2 years a bit perplexing about why China took such a passive role in this, when there were some steps they could have taken to take some of the steam out of this, to sow goodwill, to maybe sidestep all of these tariffs. But China went into, I think, traditional negotiating mode, which is you make your offer, I'll make a counteroffer. There's nothing wrong with that, but it took place at a time when Trump had imposed these tariffs. So the time was working against them rather than working for them. So to your point, I think Trump does want to resolve the China trade issues, but he'll have an appetite for something else, whether it's back to immigration, whether it's trade friction with another country. We don't know yet, but it is interesting to me that he almost is compulsive in his need to seek some kind of disruptive tactic in sort of global patterns.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of the possible political restrictions to both sides in actually pursuing and perhaps even accelerating this trade conflict. So now we have seen for a while sort of that the consequences of these tariffs are beginning to hit certain sectors in America, and you can see sort of that they are becoming more vociferous. They complain against what's been going on, and you can see sort of a development going from there, going from here, which leads to sort of more opposition towards the Trump administration coming from states that are pretty important for Trump if he wants to win in 2020. And then you have on the Chinese side, I mean, a lot of people think about the Chinese government as being sort of this unitary entity that only speaks with one voice. But there is also indications that there are frictions on the Chinese side as well, with people complaining about the Chinese government in these negotiations, why they haven't been more active, more proactive in trying to resolve some of these problems, because these tariffs are also hitting the Chinese economy. So how far do you think both sides can take this before politics is going to bite them in the back?
Well, yeah, look, by the way, both sides have sort of strong elements of rationalism, but also elements of nationalism, and as you point out, domestic politics. So there's several moving pieces here. But over the long run, rationalism tends to dominate, meaning I think leadership in both capitals realizes that these tariffs are harmful. There's an economic cost. If we could wrap them up in good order, get some kind of improvement in trade regime, we can declare success. So I think that's where the sentiment is in Washington, and I suspect that's where it is in Beijing. However, politics and public relations have now entered the picture. So I think China and the U.S. are more or less in agreement substantively what needs to be done, but this has to be put forward in a way so China looks like it's doing it to its own benefit, not under pressure, not because U.S. insisted, but because it seeks to have improved market conditions. So China has to own its own decision. It can't say somebody else made this decision for me. And unfortunately, Trump sort of took the conversation the wrong way by publicly making comments about, China was backsliding, and so we broke off negotiations, and I won't make machine. So he's making it a bit of bluster and very public discussion, which I don't think is helpful. So I think this just pushes back the timing of which we can actually come to some sort of agreement. But my guess is China is comfortable changing the requirements on licensing, so we no longer have required intellectual property, compulsory IP sharing, that we no longer have compulsory JVs in areas like autos, that some reduction in tariffs, some more segments opened up. So both sides can comfortably say we've taken steps to improve the trade relationship, and both sides can declare victory. But it has to be done. Each side has to be able to say we got what we wanted, we did what we wanted, and our country's better off. It has to be presented as a win-win, which in my view it is. But if I had to give some advice, I'd give advice to the U.S. side, which is to say you've made your points. The Chinese has to sort of absorb these points and think it through from their perspective and come back with their proposals, and this will just take some time. And I would not make any public threats about additional tariffs. I wouldn't say that publicly at all because it makes it more difficult for China to move.
Is there a trajectory in Chinese economic policy now where they are moving towards more of reforms, which is going to lead to sort of more market openings and greater ability for foreign countries to
I wouldn't
trade
say
with them?
that. I'd say it's more of status quo management now. I mean, Xi Jinping did not come into office as a reformer. He came in as, I think, a steward. But from his perspective, I think he'd say, actually, the reforms were quite significant and quite successful, so you don't necessarily have to reform at the same pace and the same way every year. That Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successors did a very impressive job of moving China toward market economics, but there might not be that kind of evolution going ahead. So it's more of I think if you ask Chinese leadership their view now, they'd say, look, we think we have the right balance between private sector participation in the economy, but the government still playing a role in what we deem are sensitive industries or national industries, steel, airlines, telecommunications, finance, and we're comfortable with that balance.
And finally, how do you see Europe in sort of this trade war between the United States and China? I mean, on the one hand, you have Europe largely sharing America's concerns with market access and commercial policies in China. On the other hand, they have chosen a different methodology in trying to deal with it, and they are complaining that America isn't willing to cooperate much more closely with Europe in addressing all these policy concerns they have with China.
Right.
On the other hand, it's not that Europe sits on a better formula for how to deal with China in order to reach success. And it's almost gotten to the point sort of where many Europeans start to sort of almost say that, perhaps the worst outcome here is actually that America succeeds. They're actually going to get that because it's going to, present Europe with a fait accompli, which is a deal between China and America. Is going to get American firms a lot more preferential access to the Chinese markets that European firms won't get, and it forces Europe to go in a direction which they would be very uncomfortable with.
I'll tell you, that's a really interesting observation. I'll tell you what I see missing in the European discussion and in the U.S. discussion is, there's a view in life, in whether it's business or personal life or anything you're involved in, there's a bias we have as human beings that we tend to manage what's bad and not manage what's good. So you tend to devote disproportionately your attention, your efforts to what you see as a problem and trying to fix a problem, instead of saying, what kind of ultimate solution do I want and why don't I work toward this kind of ultimate solution? And so I think this is quite a defect in the U.S. political leadership right now, but also I would say in Europe. Say, where does Europe want to go? Meaning, don't make it all about China. Don't simply look at a chart and say which which trading partner has the most problems, and why don't I have negotiations with that partner? I think you're almost playing to a weakness rather than playing to a strength. The strength Europe has is this enormously successful economy, largest market in the world. Why not play to that? And so I would say the same thing to the United States. I would say, why don't you work on global initiatives, regional initiatives, liberalizing where you can liberalize, and don't devote all of your energy to one market, although China is a large market and does require some focus because there are problems. But if you simply worked on, the U.S. worked on TPP and it worked on US-EU free trade agreement, that in itself would set a pace of trade liberalization and trade reform, and China would be induced to cooperate. I'll give you one example. Auto safety standards. If you had a US-EU accord on what constituted auto safety standards, Japan would come on board, and then you'd have sort of 90% of the world, ex-China, into a common standard. That it's very easy to talk to China and say, we welcome you into this group, we welcome you to join us, but we're already sort of setting the pace for world liberalization in autos. So there's an enormous argument there for the U.S. and the EU to come to accords in these important sectors, and it'll provide framework for global liberalization, and China will have an enormous incentive to join that, or else it risks it being isolated.
And how do you read American politics when it comes to relations with Europe? Is there any appetite, to think, at all for negotiating anything with Europe?
I'll tell you what's interesting. The problem is not in the U.S. You could say the administration's got to formally push it.
Sure.
But there's political appetite for this. The most frequently voiced concern about trade liberalization, I think, is a bit misplaced, but it's commonly voiced, is this sort of wage arbitrage that we can't liberalize with Mexico or Thailand because lower wage rates and jobs are going to offshore. And that's not a terribly accurate bit of criticism, but it has a certain hold. The point is, people know that's not true vis-a-vis Europe, that nobody's going to move an auto parts plant to France or Germany. Wage rates might even be higher. So the countries will be competing on all sorts of bases, but it won't be on the basis of wages. And so that people get comfort from that. So especially our friends in the Democratic Party and union-oriented don't have that kind of neuralgic problem with EU free trade that you've seen with other kind of trade agreements.
So they're waiting for Europe. Is that the case then? So...
Well, I think we need leadership in Europe, but you also, I think, need a stronger push from the U.S. Interestingly, Trump is a grievance-driven approach to politics, so he fixates on what he doesn't like, but he's never really articulated what he does like. Back to manage what's good, don't put all your energy into managing what's bad. He really believes in managing what's bad and talking about what he doesn't like. The trouble is you end up focusing on these problems, which might be fine, but you're not moving toward a greater good for the country.
All right.
Thank you, Frederick.
It's been great talking to you, Frank.
Enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching.